Cheers and welcome. My name is Mark Mandel. Thank you for coming on this journey with me on today's new episode of a brand new show that I'm calling Customer Experience Changemakers. Let me take a moment to introduce this new show because it is episode number 1 of this new show, and I'm glad that you're here to take a look at it. You know, for those of you who know me from the past, you know I've done a lot of these video podcasts now for coming up on a year. And during these video podcasts, I've used different show formats to introduce some of my friends in the customer experience industry to you, some of whom are client-side practitioners, some of whom are vendor-side companies. You know, today, this Changemakers show is something new, and let me explain what it is and where I believe it plays an important role. Changemakers for me is about the entrepreneurs out there, the people who are out there thinking, using the Apple terminology, thinking different. They're out there, these are the guys in customer experience in the solution space on the vendor side of the conversation who are not out there just following the next guy's path, but rather people who are trying to pave their own roads and have a different capability or a different story or a different value proposition that I think is really important and really exciting. Some of you have went to either business school or may have read articles and books. You may have heard the term blue ocean strategy, red ocean strategy. I'm a big fan of blue ocean strategy thinking, where it's about going into a new direction, where there's not other competition, where there's not another clone. You think about most of the customer experience industry on the tech side, there's too many of us who are out there just saying, you know what, I'm going to build a company by just making a cheaper clone of Qualtrics or a cheaper clone of Medallia. That's not very interesting to me. The gentleman who I'm going to have on here in a couple of minutes with me, his name is Richard Owen. And Richard is out there doing whatever the opposite of that is. Richard's out there saying, you know what? The stories that Qualtrics and Medallia are telling you are just fine for Qualtrics and Medallia, but they're not fine for me. I believe, and as does Richard, that there is a better story, a better proposition in the world of customer experience technology that he's out there telling, and I want him to share that story with you in just a few minutes. And so that's really the purpose of this show, is to spotlight these entrepreneurs in the customer experience vendor side of the equation who are out there telling a uniquely different and more valuable story than the other guys. This is the first time we're doing this. And so again, thank you for coming along. We'll get it right along the way as we do this together. Before I bring Richard out, though, I wanted to take a few minutes and just like I normally do on my other shows, just do a little bit of housekeeping together with you. The first thing I want to talk about, because you guys have all responded overwhelmingly in the past year, every time I have what I call the Customer Experience Book Club, I give away books as my gift. And I keep holding up copies of, for example, this book here called Experience Rules, written by Michael Hinshaw and Diane Majors, 2 good friends of mine in the CX space. This is one of my favorite recent how-to books in the world of customer experience work. And I have about 10 copies left of this book here at my house that have been given to me by Michael and Diane specifically to give to you. So if you want a free copy as my gift, or even a couple of copies, just reach out to me and say, hey, give me a copy of Michael's book and I'll make sure that it's on its way to you. It's a terrific book. The next housekeeping item I want to talk a little bit about is next week. We're doing this show live today on June 19th. But next week, starting Monday, June 23rd, is the beginning of the North American Forrester Customer Experience event. It's pretty much that whole week, from the 23rd through the end of the week in Nashville, Tennessee. I'll be there for the week, as maybe you are too. But if you don't know much about the show, the way I describe the Forrester conference these days, it's kind of like the Woodstock of customer experience work, where it's going to be probably, 1,000 or 1,100 people, maybe 1,200 people getting together for a week and looking at, all the latest trends, the new ideas, the new innovations, networking with each other in and around the customer experience space. As I said, I'll be there. It's going to be a scene. If you're on the fence about going to Nashville next week, in part because of the costs, let me know. I can probably figure out a way to get you a discount to get into that show. If you'd like to come along, I could probably get you a reduced price conference pass and maybe some other benefits as well. So just let me know if you'd like to get into the Forrester show, and I'll do what I can to help you out. If you are coming, I want to try, if you'll indulge me for a moment, I want to try an experiment with you here. I don't know how far this show reaches into our industry. I have no way to gauge the interest and the reach of this program at this point because it's newness. So I want to try an experiment relative to next week. What I want to say is, if you're here today listening to this show and you're going to Forrester next week, the first person who finds me at Forrester and says they heard or saw this show, I have a $100 bill in my pocket to give you. I just want to say I'll give you $300 just for the sake of saying you saw the show. But the catch is you got to have seen the show. So if you're listening here, make a mental note, find that guy, Mark Mandel, next week at the show and say you heard or saw this show. And again, a $100 bill in my pocket will be in your hands. It's my gift for listening in to this show. The last thing in terms of housekeeping about next week's show I also want to talk about is next Wednesday evening. Wednesday evening, June 25th, is I bought a bunch of tickets to go to something in Nashville that I think is really fun. It's called the Grand Ole Opry. I don't know if you've heard of the Grand Ole Opry, but it's like ultimate hardcore Nashville, Tennessee. If you're into that whole country music scene, and it's fun, the Grand Ole Opry is like the epicenter of country music. And I bought a bunch of tickets to go see the show that evening, which is walkable from where the conference is. We don't have to get on a bus or a van or an Uber. It's right there. It's right across the parking lot. And I hope you'll consider coming as my guest. It's going to be a fun evening. I'm buying dinner, I got show tickets, drinks, have a good evening. And all you have to do is come find me and say, let me come, or even message me here beforehand and say, let me come to the Grand Ole Opry. And I'll make sure that one of those tickets is set aside for you in the hope that you do come. Now, for the real reason that we're getting together here, what I really want to do is take a moment and talk about a gentleman who's become very important in my life. His name is Richard Owen. And I realize that many of you know or even think you know Richard Owen. You know, I'll give you a quick anecdote. I must have introduced Richard now, or so I thought, to a couple dozen people since I've begun partnering with Richard over the last 6 or 7 months. And it turns out that a lot of the people that I was introducing Richard to, Richard already knew. You know, people come up and say, hey, didn't we do such and such like 10 years ago? And sure, Richard's one of these guys that is just so uber connected in the customer experience world. It's hard to introduce him to new people because everybody knows him. But he's one of those guys that I think walks the walk as it relates to not just customer experience minded work, but is out there making differences. He's out there paving those new roads. He's out there making changes to how we think about the work that we do. And I can't think of a gentleman who more closely epitomizes the values I was talking about a few minutes ago about what is a change maker than Richard Owen. And Richard Owen, through his new company, or his recent company, OCX Cognition, and I have been partnering together, as I said, since late last year. And it's a partnership that I'm especially excited about and especially proud of. Because of that affiliation, I get to learn so much and be part of these stories that Richard's out there building. And it's such a thrill for me to be part of that storyline, I can't even begin to put into words. So with that said, I have Richard ready to come on, join me on stage here, and we're going to hopefully just have a great conversation about the things that Richard's doing with his company, OCX Cognition, at the intersection of customer experience and artificial intelligence. Richard, you're here. Thanks for hanging out.
Oh, thank you very much. You know, I used to joke that of all the introductions I've ever had, that was the most recent. but actually that was one of the most generous. So I'll pocket that as well. So thank you.
I'll just take the recency. The reality is, Richard, you're not new in this business. A lot of people know you. A lot of people have met you. You've had the opportunity through various companies that you've had leadership roles in to serve a lot of CX leaders over the years. I feel like I've known your story for a decade now, but people listening might not. Can you take a couple of minutes and just kind of talk about you? Not that you and I don't like talking about ourselves, but you, and just give a little background on where you came from and kind of where you're at relative to the tech space.
Sure. I mean, I think that, long story short, I mean, I'm British from Liverpool, but I came to the United States to my graduate work at MIT, built my first career at Dell Computer Corporation, not a bad place to be, landed in the 1990s, ended up running a big part of Dell's business in Asia out of Japan, ran Dell's internet operation globally. And I say all that only because to some extent, my journey into CX started as a general manager running what was a very, very big business, and realizing that one of the big advantages we had was the notion we delivered a superior experience. And people at Dell believed that. And it was measurable, and we cared about it. And so when I got into the software industry, I was very interested in getting into this space. An opportunity presented itself with a company called Satmetrix, which at the time was working with Fred Reichheld on creating this methodology that became Net Promoter Score. And so we had this massive breakthrough in terms of people's attention span amongst leadership when NPS came out. And, that became sort of my home for the next 15 or 16 years. We obviously made a lot of good business serving large enterprises with what I consider to be traditional CX programs, survey-based programs. But we also built the Net Promoter certification, which I'm very proud of, which was, I think, objectively the most popular training program in the industry. We lost count at 7,000 companies.
A lot of people signed up for that.
How do you lose count? But we lost count. But we know that 7,000 companies had signed up for it globally. So that kind of brings us to today, really.
Interesting. And so your journey, though, from Satmetrix to your current company with OCX Cognition, it's certainly kind of the next iteration on that same journey that you've been on, right? It's like kind of the third act of your career, or the fourth act of your career, right? And I think what might be the most important and impactful work of all of them.
Yeah, I think in some ways everything I've done sort of qualifies me to have a viewpoint today, right? And it's interesting because I got into the customer experience industry for honest reasons, right? Not because I was coming at it because I was a practitioner in CX, but because I was a business manager and I thought CX had value. So my perspective's always been, guy who's running a P&L, how is this useful to me? And we could see in as early as 2003 that we were getting the attention of leadership using survey-based data to calculate NPS and report on root cause analysis. And it was hugely successful early on, but it was massively frustrating at the same time. I mean, standing up in front of a leadership team and presenting data that was based on, maybe 10% of the customers, the wrong respondents anyway, talking about limited insights as to what you could tell them. Yeah. Even the enthusiasm for customer experience couldn't hide the fact that if you had an honest viewpoint from most of the people in the room, they'd say, yeah, this is kind of interesting and curious, but it's not telling me how to build a better company. And so when we sold Satmetrix, Brian Curry and I, who's my chief operating officer, sort of said, well, if we're ever going to stay in this industry, we have to completely rethink this. And technology works like that, Mark, as you know. Look, every iteration of technology totally disrupts the prior iteration. And this happens time and time again. We should expect it. In 2003, people were making the argument to me that said, email surveying will never work.
Yeah.
You have to basically phone people up. There's no way people will respond by email, right? And today you've got a mass part of the market saying, oh, this whole AI business is kind of risky and difficult, and I don't understand it. But every wave of technology works like this. And what is today considered leading edge is really just an opportunity for more progressive thinkers in the industry to jump on something better before the rest of the market comes. And, I think for your audience, the challenge is always, what do you want to do? Not just for your business, but for your career. Do you want to be at the front of this? Or do you want to be sitting in the back seat being dragged along behind it? And that's the challenge I think we all have. Me, I want to be at the front of the bus.
I think that's the right seat to be in. Richard, I'm looking at the trends that I see. And from my perspective, there's nothing more groundbreaking and moving more quickly than AI. I mean, again, I'm an old enough guy where I can look back in history and say, I remember 2 or 3 major shifts in the tech space. I remember when computers became personal. I remember when the web browser shipped kind of Netscape or whatever the version before that was called, in the browser the first time. Remember when now phones became smart. I think AI is going to be bigger and more impactful to probably every company and every person than those maybe added up.
Yeah, back in the day when me and Charlie Babbage were hanging out, talking about computers, all this seemed very fanciful. But I think, look, the tech industry loves to say, this is the next big thing, and it's going to be bigger than everything else before. And, maybe fresh in people's minds, the metaverse, the metaverse was going to be transformative. It wasn't that long ago. Don't see too much on that. So I think there's a tendency for people to go, AI, it's everywhere. It's hyped like crazy. Everything is AI washed. I mean, now you get AI vacuum cleaners and AI toothbrushes, right? So there's a huge amount of nonsense. And somehow that can obscure what's actually happening. I think if we're objective about it for a second, the rate of progress in capability, and I define that as the ability of machines to move into general purpose technologies that can be applied to solving business problems. The acceleration is unbelievable. It's being fueled by eye-popping levels of investments in foundational models, right? I mean, people drop 100 billion on something and don't think too much about it. And so we have this race to build massive platforms that are unprecedented in the tech industry in terms of their size, scope, and potential. And all that points to the fact that one way or another, this is going to change people's lives. Oh, and one other thing, I think one of the things that's truly changed people's perception of AI, of course, has been ChatGPT. Mm-hmm. Look, at the end of the day, it's not that it's necessarily large language models and necessarily, the end point or the true revolution, mm-hmm. but they made accessible to people something that was just, invisible up to that point. Oh, now you've got a natural language chat interface and you can talk to this and you can ask questions and it comes back with amazing answers. It can write you a screenplay. That makes AI seem very tangible, which I think in of itself is a big part of the trick. How do we make these technologies useful? And that's going to accelerate things massively. And I'll say one final thing on acceleration, Mark, because I was having this debate about procrastination just the other day. And there's a tendency for people to say, well, we're not a leader. Our business isn't a leader. I'm not a leader. I want to wait to see how this pans out. There's a difference in AI than previous waves of technology. The nature of it in terms of the accumulation of machine learning expertise, the way machines learn, accumulate data, build more data, means that laggards are going to get left behind at a far more rapid pace than in any previous generation of technology. In fact, it's not an exaggeration to say that if you fall behind, catching up might simply be a mathematical impossibility because your competition has data sets that they've accumulated, which are just going to keep growing and getting better, and algorithms get better. And so we're in an unusual race, a race where to some extent, if you fall behind, you can't just put the gas pedal down and catch up. you may never catch up.
Yeah. I mean, and it's interesting. You raised an interesting point looking back on history first before we move on from it. I'm going to make a very intentional comparison between not just AI, but you mentioned like Chat GPT, right? And the web, but specifically, the web, when it was new, became accessible when the browser came along, but that's not the beginning of the web. The web predates the browser, just as AI predates ChatGPT. But it was a way for using the Apple terminology, the mere mortal, to get into this brave new world and explore it and to consumerize it a little bit and to make it accessible to non-data scientists and non-networking experts and non-whatever. Right? And I think that's the stage that we're in now in the generative AI side of the world. Is we're seeing a lot of consumerization of AI by way of these initiatives and products like ChatGPT and those that look like it.
Yeah.
Right? And I think you're taking a different path, right? You're not out there building another chatbot. You're out there saying, you know what? I think, I don't want to paraphrase for you, but one of the things that really gets me all kind of in a good way hot and bothered a little bit about what you're doing is you're taking both machine learning and generative AI. And the way I interpret it, you're using both for what they're great at. You're taking machine learning to do things like pattern and signal detection in data and large data sets. And then using generative AI to explain it. Right?
Yeah, I think, I think it's interesting when we think of the fundamental problem we've had, and again, coming at this from a CX industry perspective, and you say, we've been running this paradigm, and to some extent, I'd like to think it got kicked off a lot with the original research around NPS. But for a lot of companies, we've been running this paradigm where we surveyed customers, we got some NPS data, we got some root cause analysis, we ran some closed loop activities on it, and that was the gig. Yep. Now, notwithstanding some forays into contact center where we'll run some natural language processing on contact center conversations, which enables you to do interesting things in the contact center. For the mainstream work around CX, that was the model 20 years ago. It's still the model today. Some embellishments, but that's it.
Yep.
But what if that's fundamentally achieving 5% of its potential? Right. So instead of 5% of your customers, what if you had 100% of your customers? Every single customer near instantaneously scored. So yep. A customer buys from you and days later, they're a promoter. Any customer, without answering a survey. And it rests on a fundamental belief, which is that the way people respond, whether they become promoters, passives, or detractors, using that terminology, is entirely predictable to a degree. And if it's predictable, then it's a candidate for machine learning. And the only question we have is, do we have the root causes of that prediction? Do we have the data that informs that? And do we have the tools and technologies to be able to answer that question? And the answer now is candidly and obviously perhaps, yes, we can. So if you could predict every single customer, how they would respond to a survey, then all of a sudden, instead of having 5% of your customers twice a year, 100% of your customers every week, your level of insight changes dramatically. And that was kind of the baby steps in some ways around AI. Now, the point you're making about generative is perhaps even more exciting. So what we actually would love to do is not just understand whether a customer is a promoter. We'd like to understand why. Yep. And in a very specific way. We don't want to just have these key driver generalities. Well, they're not that satisfied with support experience. No, I want to know specifically what is it measurable about support that we're underperforming at? Where's the inflection point? How do I quantify that? And I'd like that for 1,000 variables, not just for some 5-6 questions they answer. So that's possible. That's cool. Achievable. Now the sizzle is, okay, so you've got that. You now have every account, every customer. You now have accurate attribution for every single one of them. Can I generate the next best action? Can I generate the prescription? And this is where AI is mind-blowing, because not only can you prescribe action, but you can teach the AI to talk the language of your own company. So let's say that for the sake of argument, you're in a manufacturing business and you're manufacturing widgets. The AI learns about your widgets. They learn about your playbooks. They learn about your sales strategy. They learn about your marketing positioning relative to competitors. And it looks at the health of an account, and it looks at the reason that account is healthy or unhealthy. And it says, if I were one of the best salespeople in the company and I had access to all the best information in the company about products and strategies, what would I do?
Yep.
And it comes up with that. And here's the kicker. It'll turn that into natural language, a playbook, a script, an email, text, anything you want in any language at any time. And that just sounds insane. But today it's absolutely working. And that's where your large language models and your excitement matches to the underlying data technologies that become available. And once you see that, this is no going back. You don't sit there and say, oh yeah, we're going to close the loop on 5% of our customers, by basically telling our people, hey, call them back and ask if it's okay. Now you're into a totally different world.
I see that. The way you describe this really resonates with me. I mean, I remember I had the luxury of doing some work with a gentleman who is a college professor currently, but he was also a consultant and an author. His name was Tom Davenport. And Davenport wrote a couple of books and a couple of really important articles, but one of the books that he wrote is called Competing on Analytics. And in the book, he describes a number of things, but one of the key takeaways for me, he described the three levels of maturity of analytics, so to speak. He talked about descriptive, predictive, and prescriptive. So he talks about descriptive is like, what do you do about it? I'm sorry, it's what happened, right? Summarize the past for me. Predictive, all things trending equal, what's going to happen. And prescriptive, what do I do about it? Right? And I think while all three play a role in what you're describing, right, I think the action orientation of the prescription is the most important of the three. And the others become.
I think, it's the payoff, right? At the end of the day, it's the payoff. You can't get there unless you can solve the data problem, right? There's no point in being prescriptive for 5% of the customers who respond to a survey. It's a waste of time. You can't get there unless you have the predictive capability, because if you don't understand how those customers are going to turn that into behavior and why, how do you generate good actions? And then you have to have this payoff at the end where that turns into something that you can put in front of thousands of employees and they can use. And so prescription is the payoff at the end of the whole thing. And it just happens to be the piece that uses the most exciting and cool piece of technology, the natural language, the chat interfaces, but it's built on that entire foundation. And I think Davenport shared a fundamental understanding of how competitive advantage evolves in analytics. But now we're just about starting to see the realized value from this. And here's the big surprise. So as we started rolling this out to companies, two things worried us, or let's say big unknowns. One, how will employees react? So if you go to a sales team and say, Magic 8 Ball in the sky comes along and tells you that this customer is actually red. You may think they're green. You may have guessed they're green, but the Magic 8 Ball says they're red. How do you react as an employee to that predictive technology? And interestingly enough, if introduced correctly, the answer is very well. The natural question is, why is that prediction what it is? Oh, you can explain to me that? That's interesting. That changes my thinking. That changes the way I view that account. I feel better informed. So that's the first big surprise. Humans aren't as afraid of predictive technologies we might think if presented correctly. The second big surprise for me is, what's the impact of AI-generated prescriptions? Well, for the very best performers in a company, it's good, but it's not transformative. They already know the answer. They already intuit what they should be doing with this customer, whether they're a success manager or an account manager or a support rep. They kind of know the game. They've been doing it a long time. They're very good at it. But everybody else who's in the 90% that's either, marginally above average or way below average, for these guys, it's transformative. They're suddenly as smart as the best possible sales or success manager. So the productivity potential is amazing for them because they finally get that kind of machine coach that helps them become good at their job, right down to explaining how they should write emails to customers that they never had. And then the final kicker, of course, is automation, because for a lot of customers, especially long tail customers, you're not going to have humans in the loop. You're literally going to have prescriptive actions that convert into email or marketing communications, and it goes straight to the customer. And or somebody might joke, it goes straight to the customer's AI, who's going to come back and have a conversation. Right. Maybe that's where we end up. But automation is going to really support the issue at the long tail, which is otherwise just cost inefficient. So those are the big surprises. But that's not to be surprised, I suppose, when we think about it.
So I see what you're saying here, and this is something that comes across as sort of net new to me. Is there might be a fourth tier to this story beyond prescription, which is orchestration, right? Moving into the activation of the prescription.
Well, yeah, it's interesting, right? For most of us now, when we get on a Zoom call or a Teams call, the first thing we see is 3 attendees and 6 AI bots.
Yes.
And it can't help but think, well, at what point do all the humans just drop off and the AI bots can have the meeting and we can get on with it, right?
Exactly.
And even scarier when you think that they can switch from English to a different language, which is much more time efficient, and then they talk amongst themselves and presumably find a way to overthrow our society. But there are huge potential in us finding ways to interact with customers differently if we understand those customers. So I keep bringing it back to this idea that everything's just cosmetic unless we understand the fundamental health of these customers, by which I mean their level of loyalty, what's driving that, their propensity to repurchase. That's foundational. Otherwise, it's all just superficial. If we don't know that, then we're just basically supplanting humans with technology to have a conversation, but we've no great insight powering that conversation. So, you think of Davenport presents it as a curve for a very good reason. These are foundations you build on to come up with a really good answer.
It's interesting. You and I had a meeting not too long ago with a gentleman in New York, and he had an interesting observation that I want to touch on with you. He was talking about, I'm not going to call it a concern or an objection. It was something he was aware of, where he said, some of our A players are going to use the terminology, I don't want to become the machine's bitch. Right. And the reality is, I look at what you were describing a minute ago, kind of A player, B player. The B players get to be up leveled by the AI if they follow the prescription, and play the game. But the A players who have already a good handle on these customer relationships, or whatever you want to couch it as, could feel like they're being dictated to in an unnecessary way. And I'm wondering if you've seen that in your practice, and if there's ways to take this AI-generated insight, this AI-generated set of recommendations and actions, and package them in ways where even the A players are willing to consume it.
So I think that there's no general answer to that problem. A lot's going to depend on culture, companies, how they approach things. Look, it reminds me of the original deployment of CRM systems or SFA systems, late 90s, right? Oh, here we are. Please enter all your contacts and your deal flow. Yeah, we know how well that went, right? I think we're still struggling. We're going to, if we're not thoughtful about this, we're going to meet internal resistance points. And to get past that, leadership needs to develop trust. And it needs to develop a belief that we are committed to our team members. We're committed to making them more successful. And frankly, a lot of companies are going totally the wrong way, right? Their first instinct with AI is, great, This is a way to cut out 20% of our contact center people.
Yeah.
Now, think for a second the signal that sends, not just to employees, but also to customers, which is, basically every form of technology is just human displacement. Now, maybe that works in the sense that you get some cost reduction. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it just backfires on you. But on a more profound level, if we're building the organization of the future, and we want that organization to be one where we have enormous levels of collaboration and cooperation with the technologies and the people, we better start thinking about how we're going to market that to our employees and how we're going to send the right signals and be thoughtful about it. And I think that there's a headline every day. I saw one the other day about, Jassy, who's the head of Amazon, talking about, the productivity curve of white collar workers and, get with the program, learn AI or be out of a job, paraphrasing, right? I think that we're going to have to think this through very carefully at a societal level as well. But for your audience, if I'm a CX professional right now, and I'm early in my career, I'm thinking about where I want to be 5-10 years from now.
Yep.
This is an enormous personal opportunity, right? To set yourself apart, to build a skill set that's in the future, to maintain that skill set.
And to future-proof it.
And to future-proof it as much as is possible, right? And I'd go as far as to say that if I'm at a company that isn't moving in future directions, isn't willing to even speculate or try things or pilot, for goodness sake,
yep,
then I'm in the wrong company. I'm in and this isn't going to look good at the point when employers are looking for the next set of skills and they're looking for the experience. So it's both a tremendous opportunity for people and a tremendous risk. And I think people are at an inflection point in their personal choices and how they go about this. In the same way they probably were, Mark, 20 years ago when NPS came out and it was like, well, are you going to hitch your wagon to traditional CX programs and telephone surveying and everything, or are you going to try and get onto this wagon which is going to define the next generation of technology? So opportunity and risk, yeah, but also a hell of a lot of fun. Come on, this stuff's cool.
It's really cool.
Why not?
So what I hear you saying is that a couple of things. For me, the key takeaways from the last few minutes are pretty clear. That, we've spent as CX professionals our careers asking customers how much they love us. And I think that the world has changed. And I think that we're to a point now where that feedback loop is, for lack of a better term, running out of gasoline. I'm going to the conference in a couple of days, and I'm a t-shirt guy. I should get dressed up. I should wear my velvet jacket, but I'm a t-shirt guy. And I had a custom t-shirt made for next week that just had a big quote on it. Just said, quote, "I love CX surveys," end quote, said by nobody. The reality is, why burden your customer and rely on that direct request of, hey, how much do you really love us, if there are signals in their behaviors and there are other indicators that we can mine from?
Right. Well, look, there's an old trope, right, that people roll out about Henry Ford and, faster horses, right?
Yep.
I think where people go wrong is today, if Henry Ford was doing that, he'd be surrounded by Armani-clad salespeople explaining why what you need is a marginally faster horse. And by the way, our horses have swishier tails, and don't listen to the guys telling you need automobiles, right? And I think this is what muddies the waters. If you're today a professional in the industry, the incumbent companies, and no disrespect at all, because this is technology, they have built fabulous businesses based on the traditional paradigm. And in every technology industry, the defenders of the status quo hang on and try and persuade you that the status quo is the safe way, it's the best way. And they'll be very good at making that argument, and they should be. And if you're a CX professional looking at that, it's very tempting to be seduced by the idea that staying static or improving at the margin is acceptable because that's what you're being sold. These are faster horses salespeople, and they're very good at pitching faster horses.
Yep.
The challenge is recognizing that that is part of today's solution inevitably, but how do you dip your toe in the future? How do you start to look beyond that? And you're not going to find that from the incumbents because it's not in their interest to disrupt the industry.
Yep.
You're going to find it from guests at programs like yours, Changemakers. And look, you can totally disagree with me. You can say my point of view is absolutely wrong. I think you'd be wrong in that assumption, but fine, it's possible.
I've been known, my wife will tell you I've been wrong often, but I think I'm right.
You know, I'm reminded of that Michael Burry quote from The Great Short. Of course, I could be completely wrong. I guess people who are wrong always think that they're right, you know. But I'm not wrong at a macro level. Whether our approach is right or somebody else has a better idea around this, 5 to 10 years from now, we will not be counting on surveys as our primary way of understanding customers. If you're stuck with that idea, then you are fundamentally clinging onto an outmoded concept. And I can't help you. I mean, again, don't disagree with me. Don't agree with me. Find a better way of thinking about it. But I think go out there and find something.
So let's talk about surveys for a minute. I'm assuming surveys play a role in your vision, but they're not the primary vehicle anymore.
We like surveys. They're training data for machines. And at the end of the day, to teach a machine to think like your customer, you have to have some basis on which to teach it.
Yep.
And surveys today are still the best way. Now, actually, they're the Achilles heel, because any dependence on surveys staples you to something of a sinking ship. And so any way you can get customer trade-offs and priorities differently. And I think some of the innovations, that there are some innovative guys thinking about how to interrogate customers in very original ways. And interrogation sounds terrible, right? It sounds like, you know, we're strapping them to a chair, but engage customers in conversation, perhaps, that's going to tease out their trade-offs they want to make and how they think about companies. We're going to see some innovation there, and that's going to help us build better models. But it's a means to an end. But the traditional model of, you know, I'm going to email someone a survey, 5% of them are going to get opened up. Depending on different levels of bias, we're going to get something of a correct answer, and they'll answer 5 or 6 more questions to help us figure out why. That model of surveying is going to die out. We use it today for training machines, but even we're looking at it saying it's the Achilles heel of the whole approach, and we need to wean ourselves off even that.
Yeah, I mean, even survey response rates, to your point. I mean, I remember not that long ago, Richard, where it was commonplace to get a 20 or 30% response rate on a survey, if not more. And now we're lucky to get 4%, 3%, 2%.
I stood up at the Net Promoter Conference probably 15 years ago and said, survey response rates are on inevitable decline. And I probably got booed off the stage. It wasn't the first time. I think my own audience wasn't happy with me saying that. And I was in the survey business. There's no way to halt this decline. And it's, if you think about it, it's a fundamental problem. It's anything, economists like to call it tragedy of the commons. It's an overused free resource called customers' time. If everybody is surveying customers more and more and more, lower marginal cost, they're not going to suddenly start allocating more of their time to answering surveys. They are in fact allocating less of their time, and that more surveys, less time, you do the math.
Yep.
Response rates are heading on a curve to zero. It's just a matter of time. And that's going to create challenges for us, even when it comes to building the machine algorithms. The plus we have is that the surveys are a tool to an end. They're not the end itself. But I think people are worried about response rate decline and framing it as, well, it was 6% last year, it's 5% this year, are totally misthinking this. They should be thinking, how do we get off this jalopy of the technology industry and get somewhere where we can start thinking differently about this whole problem?
That's fascinating. So it sounds very clear that surveys, at least today, do play a role, but instead of it being as direct one-to-one relationship to insight generation, you talk about training the AI, training the model, training the machine, and using that to then using the models to then amplify or to replicate or to find those patterns and signals in the feedback that you got and apply it to the unanswered majority.
Exactly. And look, the good news is surveys are a commodity, right? There's terrific product out there.
Sure.
And
The net cost of nearly zero on a per unit basis.
right. And if you're locked into a contract store where you're spending a fortune on these survey engines, well, do yourself a favor, get out of that contract, right? At this point, it's a race to the bottom. The vendors know it. That's what happens with technology. You're the beneficiary. So let's say that you had a spend, and I'm picking a very large company, and you were spending $1 million a year on a CX program, and 800 of that was going to survey technology 2 or 3 years ago. 100 of that's going to survey technology 2 or 3 years from now. Now, the space that opens up for you to do innovation in technology is massive. And so we're going to see commoditization of surveying technology. We're going to see cost reduction. All the innovation is going to take place around it. And that creates an opportunity, to actually spend the same money, but just get a dramatically better result. But that's the history of technology, Mark, right? Every year I've been in the industry, it's spend the same or less and get more. Yep. So no surprise.
Well, you're offering dramatically more, aren't you? I mean, you were saying earlier, what your proposition fundamentally is built on is this notion that it creates the appearance of 100% fulfillment rate in a real-time, replenishment way.
Mathematically, it's about 1,000 times more data for your typical company, and 2,000 data attributes opposed to 5, an ability to do generative based on that and predictive analytics. Yeah, I mean, it's objectively 1,000 times better, and that shouldn't surprise us, right? I mean, if people think that's hyperbolic, why are we surprised by that? I mean, every wave of technology creates step function improvements. Frankly, you should be disappointed if we're not getting that kind of massive step function improvement in capability, especially, frankly, given that surveys is a very old technology set. It's kind of, predates a lot of modern techniques anyway. But I'm actually as interested now, Mark, in how we think about educating this generation of CX professionals.
Let's talk about it. Because we had mentioned before your NPS certification from the past.
Right.
Let's talk about what you've learned from that and what we can do now to bring that full circle.
Well, so we started NPS certification in 2008, and Fred Reicheld and my colleague Laura Brooks and I sort of wrote that original curriculum, and it was, I say, extraordinarily well adopted. I mean, we lost track at 7,000, and it was translated in multiple languages. It still sells in Japan. I mean, quite remarkable how popular it is overseas. But if you looked at it today, if you were honest about it, you'd say it's a methodology that is showing its age. I mean, it's definitely a 2008 vintage. And I think that we set out about a year ago to say, well, what could we bring that completely up to date? And there were 2 problems with that. First of all, everything had to be rewritten and rethought because the transformation is so profound. But also we recognized that whatever we came up with was going to be obsolete almost instantaneously. So we built the next generation of certification with a different model in mind, one where, first of all, rather than thinking of it as a one-off event, people go through certification, they get a badge at the end, they've learned something. We think of it as a lifetime learning experience where as the science evolves, people will evolve with it. And so that builds with a sense of community, but also new ideas, new participants. And we've been lucky enough over the last couple of years, partly through building our Iconoclast series of interviews. We've now had, over 100 leading academics and business leaders contributing input to the future of the space, which is a huge foundation, a lot of great material. We built the curriculum again from scratch. We put this into beta. We goal to have 100 companies in the beta. In 48 hours, that's sold out. We were full. And now we're planning the official launch. And the goal is to give people who are professionals in the space the same boost they got from NPS certification, a knowledge base, but with the added benefits. My ambition is to keep this current constantly. So it becomes a continuous life skills improvement. And frankly, we want people to steer the direction of it. Look, I'm not wedded to any particular area that is off limits. If someone comes to us, and we've already seen it, people saying, hey, we want a whole section on ethics. Well, AI ethics isn't really our strong domain. There's plenty of people who know all about it. Let's go find someone who's an expert in it. Let's get them to contribute, right? If that's important to our audience, let's bring it in. So we'll let the user audience also steer this. So it's not just a question of, hey, this is Richard and his team's ideas on this. It becomes as much a collaboration as well, and we'll take different directions. But with the benefit that we, in many ways, as curators, will have the expert curation viewpoint on it as well. So I'm incredibly excited about this, as you can tell. We've already seen enormous demand for this, and I think that there's enthusiasm because people want to stay on top of this from a career perspective, and they want to be able to identify that they have this expertise set. And so I get it, right? I mean, look, in our era, Mark, 100 years ago, my idea of getting that credential was go to MIT. That's what you did, right? If you're lucky enough and you won the lottery, and they just made an admission mistake and took me in. But you fast forward to today, I'm not sure that's even the right answer anymore. It's now about continuous learning and access to resources and community that enable you to continue to advance. And I think it's democratized. You don't have to get admitted to an elite university anymore, nor is your education over at age 22 or 25. It's as valid for you in your 40s and your 50s as it would have been back then. So what an exciting time to be in if we can help shape the thinking of future CX professionals.
And so you're saying that you have this new masterclass program that's open and available to early adoption?
So right now the beta is closed because we're oversubscribed. Our goal is to launch an early adoption version of this, and we're targeting roughly sometime July 17th. And so you can go and register for the early adoption version. That's no commitment on your part. That's just literally saying, because we'll do like everyone in tech does, we'll do an initial release on a limited number of people. And so he just puts you into the queue, and you can still choose not to do it. You don't like the price, you don't like the product, don't do it. But it puts you in the queue. And then we sort of go for more of a full release cycle, likely in September, October of this year, when the early adopters have kind of run through and given their feedback. And the feedback from the beta group has been remarkable. Obviously, sometimes you have to have a bit of a thick skin, Mark, because some of the feedback is, quite pointed. People aren't shy. But the fact that people have such strongly held views and amazing insights has really given us conviction that the engagement with the audience is going to be a big part of that.
That's cool.
And also we have folk in sub-Saharan Africa, we have folk in Japan, we have folk in Latin America, we have folk in Europe, and of course, probably the majority in the US. So we're getting a really interesting sort of global take on this as well, as this is getting built.
I'd love to see if I could put you on the spot for a minute and just ask a favor. And the favor is, to the extent the folks out there listening to this conversation right now, whether it be live or on the recording, want to participate as a future early adopter of this learning program, that there would be a pathway in for them as an early adopter, that you would consider them on that early adoption list. And so sometime in the July timeframe, when that next step is ready to play out, that if they queue up, that you'll be ready to take them in. Yeah,
I mean, I think that's a great idea. And that wasn't a rehearsed question. I didn't know you were going to ask that. But yeah.
It was not on the list.
I do. Yeah, I mean, I said we'd love to accommodate people. I mean, they're sort of signaling by listening to this podcast that they're interested in forward thinkers anyway, right? So I think it's a good fit for the audience. And candidly, we want to get those we want the people who start this to be the enthusiastic forward thinkers who are going to contribute to its development. So let's build a list. Let's get people's emails onto it. And look, we'll cut people a sweetheart deal. to get people started on this. You know, I'd also say this: if there are people who are between jobs, you know, so you can't go to your boss and say, "Hey, I need some training budget." We've always, and we did this with MPS as well. If you're between jobs, we'll help you out. We'll comp you into
That's
this.
nice of you.
Because you know, it help you find your job search. And look, selfishly, we know you're going to land somewhere great, and we'd like to have you as a friend when you do. So it's a win-win for both of us. So if you're between jobs and you're trying to get up to speed, let us know, and we'll find a way to make sure you're not out of pocket on any of this.
Are you also similarly open to this notion? So I know some people who listen to these shows are actually independent consultants in this space.
Yeah.
Right. And to the extent they want to build some competency and expertise in, you know, things that you advocate for and believe in, that as an independent advisor, consultant to the industry, that they can participate also in this learning program.
Yeah, we love these guys, right? I mean, we've always had an important relationship with them. And I get it. Look, if you're small scale running, maybe it's a 1 or 2 person shop, maybe it's a smaller shop. It's a tough hustle out there, right? And I think if you can tell a story that's forward thinking and innovative in any way, it helps you in your sales and marketing. And so why not get in front of this? And we'd love to collaborate somehow, help you guys get a foot up on this ladder here.
Cool.
And so, yeah, I think I fully appreciate how difficult that job is. And, you know, we'd love to help those guys.
That's awesome. Richard, I know we're right at the top of the hour coming up here, so I want to be mindful of your time and everybody else who's coming along here. Just one last question, and that is, I like to wrap these conversations up with, how do people find you if they want to continue the conversation with you? What's the best route? Is it LinkedIn? Is it email? Is it, you know, your cell phone at 11 o'clock at night? What's the best way to get hold of you?
Not the cell phone at 11 o'clock at night. I'm not even sure what 11 o'clock at night is and which time zone I'm in, but yes. So, I mean, it's super easy, right? You can write to me, richard.owen@ocxcognition.com. You can find me on LinkedIn, ping me through that. So whatever way is sort of easier. Carrier pigeon, you know, not necessarily the most effective way, but I don't think I'm too difficult to find. And look, we'd love to hear from people, even if it's to disagree. If you think that what I'm saying is nuts, send me a note saying it's nuts and you've got a different view of the universe, because we're probably wrong. I mean, the one thing we know for sure is 5 years from now, it's going to be different.
Yep.
And we just want to be directionally correct so that we can zero in on the right answers.
Makes perfect sense. And by the way, for those listening in here who want to reach Richard and who for some reason would rather go through me, I can connect you guys to Richard without a problem. So just let me know about that.
You know, he'll just extract a small fee, you know, into that.
You know, there's got to be
beer, t-shirts. There's something, right?
There's something in there. Richard, thank you for hanging out with us. It's always, I learn every time we talk from you, and I'm grateful and selfishly grateful for that. So
Marcus, that's a pleasure, mate. I really appreciate it.
You know, guys, you know, Richard's up to something that I think is real important. The work that he's doing is so groundbreaking in this AI area of customer experience and understanding customers at a new level. If you really want to think about your customers and your insights and action orientation on that insight, take a look at OCX Cognition. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised by the realities of what they've built. They built a actionable, deliverable platform today. We're not talking about future stuff. We're not talking about things that are hopefully down the road. He's delivering success today with that capability. Guys, next week, as I said, is Forrester. We'll see you guys from the Forrester show floor. It's going to be a scene. If you're coming to Forrester, come look me up. As I said, I got $100 in my pocket for you. And if you want a copy of Michael and Diane's book, just let me know, and I'll get you a copy of that as well. My friends, thank you for coming on this journey with Richard and me today. Richard, it's always fun to hang out with you, sir. And my friends, we'll see you guys next week from Nashville. Take care, guys. Bye-bye now.